My family's past was a mystery, until I learned what my ancestor found beneath the soil. I never imagined that a simple rusted metal box found in my grandmother's basement would completely change my understanding of who I am, where I come from, and how my family built the fortune I'd always taken for granted. My name is Daniel Hartwell. I'm 40 years old, and this is the story of how I discovered that my great-great-great-grandfather, an enslaved man named Samuel, found something beneath the Virginia soil that would change the trajectory of our family for generations to come. Let me start at the beginning with what I thought I knew about my family history. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a comfortable upper-middle-class neighborhood. My father, Richard Hartwell, was a successful investment banker. My mother, Grace, was a philanthropist who sat on the boards of several charities. We lived in a beautiful colonial-style home with a pool, took vacations to Europe, and I attended private schools that led to an Ivy League education. The Hartwell name carried weight in our community. We were known as one of the established black families, the kind that had made it several generations back, through what I was always told was hard work, business acumen, and strategic investments in property and railroads during the late 1800s. My great-grandfather, according to family lore, had been a shrewd businessman who capitalized on opportunities during Reconstruction. But there was always something vague about the details. When I asked questions as a child about where exactly the initial capital came from, how a black man in the 1860s and 1870s had managed to accumulate enough wealth to invest in railroads and property when most formerly enslaved people were struggling with sharecropping, the answers were always fuzzy. Your great-great-great-grandfather Samuel was an exceptional man, my grandmother Josephine would say, her eyes distant. He had opportunities that others didn't. He was wise and took advantage of them. But how? I would press. Where did he get the money to start? That's not important, she would respond, an edge to her voice that made it clear the subject was closed. What's important is what he did with it. He built something that has sustained this family for 5 generations. As I grew older, I stopped asking. I was busy with school, then college, then building my own career as an architect. I married my wife Lisa when I was 28, and we had 2 children, Marcus and Zoe, now 10 and 8. Life was good, comfortable, predictable. I gave little thought to the mysterious origins of the Hartwell fortune beyond a vague gratitude for the advantages it had provided me. Everything changed last March when my grandmother Josephine passed away at the age of 94. She had been the family matriarch, the keeper of stories and traditions, though as I mentioned, some stories she kept closer than others. After her funeral, the family gathered to sort through her belongings in the large Victorian house where she'd lived alone since my grandfather's death 15 years earlier. The house was a museum of family history. Photos lined the hallways showing generations of Hartwells, stern-faced people in formal attire from the early 1900s, my grandfather in his World War II uniform, my father's graduation from Morehouse, my own wedding photo. But I noticed, as I had many times before, that there were no photos of anyone from before about 1880. No images of Samuel, the man who supposedly started it all. Why are there no photos of Samuel? I asked my father as we sorted through boxes in the study. He paused, an old ledger in his hands. Photography was expensive back then. Not everyone had access. But we were supposedly wealthy by then, I pointed out. And there are photos of other black families from that era. I've seen them in museums. Daniel, what does it matter? My father said with exasperation. The man lived over 150 years ago. We know what's important, that he worked hard and built something for his family. That response might have satisfied me before, but something about going through Grandma Josephine's things, seeing the accumulation of 5 generations of history, made me more determined. There was a story here, and I wanted to know it. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day of sorting, when my cousin Thomas and I ventured into the basement. The basement was vast, dank, and filled with the detritus of decades. Old furniture, boxes of clothes, trunks of who knows what. We were tasked with determining what should be kept, what donated, what thrown away. In the far corner, behind a broken dresser and several boxes of moth-eaten linens, Thomas discovered a small metal trunk. It was old, the kind with a curved top and metal reinforcements covered in rust and cobwebs. Daniel, check this out, Thomas called. This thing looks ancient. We dragged it out into the light. There was no lock, just a simple latch that had corroded shut. It took both of us and a crowbar to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at our touch, was a collection of items that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. There were several leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. A collection of maps, hand-drawn on what looked like old parchment. A small leather pouch that, when opened, revealed several rough gold nuggets. And most intriguingly, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Thomas let out a low whistle. Is that real gold? I don't know, I said, my hands trembling slightly as I picked up one of the journals. The leather cover was unmarked, but when I opened it carefully, I saw handwriting in faded brown ink. The first page had a date, March 15th, 1862, and below it, in careful script, "My name is Samuel. I'm writing this so that my children and their children will know the truth of how we came to freedom." My heart began to race. This was it, the missing piece of our family history. I looked at Thomas. "We need to show this to everyone." "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, and there was something in his tone that gave me pause. "Maybe there's a reason this was hidden away." "All the more reason to see what's in it," I said, though his words had planted a seed of unease. We brought the trunk upstairs, and I called a family meeting. My father, my Aunt Carolyn, my Uncle James, and several cousins gathered in the living room. When I showed them what we'd found, the reactions were mixed. My father's face went pale. Aunt Caroline looked almost frightened. Uncle James leaned forward with intense curiosity. "Where did you find this?" my father asked quietly. "In the basement, hidden in the back corner." I held up one of the journals. "Dad, this is Samuel's journal, his actual words. Don't you want to know what he wrote?" "Some things," my father said slowly, "are kept private for a reason." "What reason?" I demanded, my frustration from years of non-answers finally boiling over. "What are you all so afraid of us finding out?" It was my Aunt Caroline who spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because the truth is complicated, Daniel. Because the way Samuel got his freedom, the way he got the money that started everything, it wasn't the story of noble hard work and business acumen we've been telling." "Then what was it?" I asked. The room fell silent. Finally, my father sighed heavily. "Read the journals." "But Daniel, remember? Samuel did what he had to do to survive, to save his family. Don't judge him by the standards of today." That night, after everyone had left and Lisa had taken the kids to bed, I sat in my study and carefully began to read Samuel's journal by lamplight. His handwriting was sometimes difficult to decipher, and his spelling was inconsistent. He had clearly taught himself to write, but his story came through with vivid, heartbreaking clarity. Samuel had been born in 1838 on a tobacco plantation called Thornfield, located in southern Virginia near the North Carolina border. The plantation was owned by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who, according to Samuel's account, was neither the worst nor the best of masters, a statement that chilled me with its matter-of-fact acceptance of an inhuman system. Samuel's father had died when Samuel was young, sold away to another plantation. His mother, Ruth, worked in the main house as a cook. Samuel himself worked in the fields from the age of 7, but showed an aptitude that caught the overseer's attention. By his teenage years, he was being used for more skilled labor, carpentry, blacksmithing, and eventually working with the plantation's limited mining operations. Thornfield, I learned from Samuel's journal, sat on land that was primarily used for tobacco, but Blackwood had also attempted to mine for various minerals. There were several shallow mines and quarries on the property where enslaved people were forced to dig for iron ore and other minerals to supplement the plantation's income. It was in one of these mines that Samuel's life changed forever. The journal entry was dated September 3rd, 1862. Today I found something that could mean death or freedom. I do not yet know which. Master Blackwood sent me and 3 others into the old North Quarry, the one that had been abandoned 2 years past, after the vein of iron ran thin. He wanted us to shore up some timbers, said he was thinking of reopening it. We were deep in, 40 feet or more, when my pickaxe struck something that sang with a different note than rock. I looked closer, and my heart near stopped. There in the wall of the quarry was a vein of gold. Not just traces, but a seam running through the rock like a river of fire. I knew what it was because I had seen gold once before. A nugget that Master Blackwood kept on his desk, brought from California by a cousin. I said nothing to the others. I pretended my pick had struck nothing but stone. But my mind was racing. If Master Blackwood knew there was gold here, he would work us to death mining it, and we would see none of the benefit while he grew rich beyond measure. That night I could not sleep. I thought of my mother, growing old and tired in the kitchen. I thought of my wife Sarah and our children, James age 6 and Mary age 3. I thought of the life of servitude stretching before them, stretching before their children until death. And I thought, what if this gold could buy us freedom? I paused in my reading, my hands shaking slightly. I knew what was coming, but seeing it in Samuel's own words was different than anything I might have imagined. Over the next several journal entries, Samuel detailed his audacious and dangerous plan. He began returning to the quarry alone whenever possible, usually late at night, using the excuse of checking the timber work. Bit by bit, under cover of darkness, he would chip away at the gold vein, collecting small amounts that he would hide on his person. "The risk is enormous," he wrote in an entry from October 1862. "If I am caught, I will be killed. Stealing is punished with whipping. But stealing gold? That would be death, and not a quick one. But I think of James and Mary, and I continue." Samuel was clever. He knew that disappearing suddenly would bring slave catchers after them. He knew that a black man traveling with gold would be assumed to have stolen it, which technically he had, though the moral calculus of stealing from someone who had stolen your entire life was not lost on me. He needed a plan. The plan took shape over months of careful preparation. Samuel confided in only 3 people, his wife Sarah, his mother Ruth, and one other enslaved man named Joseph. who had worked alongside Samuel for years and who Samuel trusted absolutely. Together, they began to prepare. Using his skills as a blacksmith, Samuel crafted a hidden compartment in a water barrel, where he slowly accumulated his stolen gold. Sarah, who worked as a seamstress, began making sturdy clothing and gathering supplies. Ruth, working in the main house, began stealing small amounts of food and hiding them away. Joseph, who was allowed to travel to town occasionally to deliver goods, gathered information about routes north and Underground Railroad contacts. "We will need enough gold to establish ourselves somewhere," Samuel wrote in February 1863. "Enough to buy land, to start a business, to live as free people, but not so much that we draw attention. We must be careful, so careful." The journals from this period were filled with details of the painstaking preparation, but also with Samuel's internal struggle. He wrote eloquently about the moral weight of what he was doing, not the taking of the gold, which he seemed to feel entirely justified in, but the risk he was putting his family through. "If we fail, if we are caught, James and Mary will suffer for my actions," he wrote. "Sarah tells me that they will suffer anyway if we remain enslaved, that their children will suffer and their children's children unto generations we will never see. She is right, and yet the weight of this decision crushes me some nights until I can hardly breathe." There were also practical considerations documented in careful detail. How much gold could they safely carry? Where could they go where they might establish new identities? How would they travel? The Underground Railroad was primarily designed to move people, not wealth. Traveling with gold made them targets for any number of people, slave catchers, bandits, or even those who might be sympathetic to fugitives, but not above stealing from them. The turning point came in July 1863. Jeremiah Blackwood's fortunes had been declining as the Civil War dragged on. Union forces were getting closer to Virginia, and there was increasing chaos and uncertainty. Some of the enslaved people on neighboring plantations had already run off when Union troops came near. Blackwood responded by becoming more strict, more watchful. He increased patrols and made escape more difficult. But he also did something that gave Samuel the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "Master Blackwood has decided to send 20 of us to work on fortifications near Richmond," Samuel wrote in late July. "This is my chance. The journey to Richmond will take us through forests and rough country. There will be moments of less supervision. Joseph, Sarah, and I have been chosen for the work detail. Ruth cannot come. She's too old, they say, to do hard labor. This breaks my heart. She says she understands. She says she has lived most of her life in chains, but she will die knowing her grandchildren will be free. She embraces me and tells me to go with God." The escape happened on August 3rd, 1863. The details in Samuel's journal were sparse, perhaps because it was too painful to relive, or perhaps because he was being cautious even in his private writing. But the basic story emerged. The group of enslaved workers being moved to Richmond was being transported in wagons, guarded but not heavily. Most of the able-bodied white men were off fighting in the war. Samuel, Sarah, Joseph, and 2 others made their break during a stop near a wooded area. They had chosen their moment carefully. Dusk, when visibility was poor, near terrain they had studied from Joseph's previous travels. "We ran," Samuel wrote simply. "We ran like I have never run, even when being chased as a child. Sarah carried Mary, and I carried James. Joseph led the way. Behind us, we heard shouts and then gunfire. One of the others who ran with us, Thomas, a young man of barely 20, fell. We could not stop. God forgive us, we could not stop. We ran into the forest and kept running. They didn't stop running, in a manner of speaking, for 3 weeks. The journal from this period was written in brief, hurried entries, clearly composed when they had moments of rest. They moved mostly at night, using the North Star and directions Joseph had memorized from Underground Railroad contacts. They avoided major roads, traveling through forests and swamps, dealing with exhaustion, hunger, fear, and the constant terror of being caught. "James asks why we must walk so much gamouage," Samuel wrote. "He's only 6 years old, and his feet are blistered and bleeding. Mary cries, but cannot understand enough to be told to be quiet. Sarah and I take turns carrying them when they can walk no more. Every noise is a slave catcher. Every snap of a twig is a dog on our trail. I have never known such fear." But they had one advantage that most escaping enslaved people did not: the gold. When they absolutely had to, Samuel could break off a small piece of gold and trade it for food, for shelter, for information. He did this sparingly and carefully, usually leaving the gold with Joseph or Sarah to make the trade, since a black man with gold was too suspicious. But it made the difference between survival and capture. They made contact with the Underground Railroad in Maryland at a safe house run by a Quaker family named Garrett. The journal entry from this meeting showed Samuel's overwhelming relief and gratitude, but also his caution. He did not tell the Garretts about the gold beyond showing them enough to prove they could pay their way. The family arranged their transport further north, to Pennsylvania. "The Garretts ask few questions," Samuel wrote. "They say only that we are God's children and deserve freedom. They give us food, clean clothes, and rest. Their young daughter, barely older than James, teaches him a song. For the first time in weeks, I see my son smile. From Pennsylvania, they made their way to New York, and from there Samuel faced a choice. Many formerly enslaved people were heading to Canada, where they would be completely beyond the reach of slave catchers and the Fugitive Slave Act. But Samuel had a different idea. "Canada is safe, but it is cold and far from everything I have known," he wrote. "I think instead of the growing cities, where a black man might establish himself in business, where money can buy respectability and safety, where my children can have education and opportunity, I think of Philadelphia or New York or perhaps Boston." They ultimately chose Boston, arriving in late September 1863. The city had a substantial free black community, and the chaos of the Civil War meant that fewer questions were asked about the origins of new arrivals. Samuel's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would claim to be a free black man who had been working in Philadelphia and had saved money to move his family to Boston for better opportunities. The gold would be sold off bit by bit, carefully to different buyers, so as not to draw attention. "I sold the first piece of gold to a jeweler on Hanover Street," Samuel recorded. "My hands shook as I gave it to him, certain he would know it was stolen, that he would call the authorities. But he merely examined it, weighed it, and paid me. I walked out of his shop with more money in my pocket than I had ever held in my life. I went directly to a boarding house, where Sarah and the children waited. When I showed Sarah the money, she wept." The next several journals detailed the careful, deliberate way Samuel built their new life. He was methodical and clever. He used the gold sparingly at first, establishing himself in legitimate work. He found employment as a blacksmith and carpenter, skills that were always in demand. He rented a small house in a respectable neighborhood. He enrolled James in school, one of the schools for black children that existed in Boston. Only after a year of establishing themselves did Samuel begin to invest the proceeds from the gold more substantially. He bought property, a small commercial building that he rented out. Then another. He invested in a shipping venture. He was careful to always have legitimate sources of income to explain his growing wealth. "I tell people I had savings from years of work," Samuel wrote in 1865. "I tell them I had family who left me an inheritance. I tell them whatever story will be believed. The truth, that I stole gold from the man who enslaved me, stays locked in my heart. Only Sarah, Joseph, and I know the full truth." Joseph, I learned from the journals, had stayed with Samuel's family in Boston. He had become Samuel's business partner, and the two men worked together for years. There was a poignant entry from 1866, after the Civil War had ended. "The war is over. The slaves are free. Joseph and I spoke today about what this means. We can never go back to Virginia. There are people there who would remember us, who would ask questions about how we came by our wealth. But my mother, Ruth, is still there, or was there. I sent money through intermediaries, through the Freedmen's Bureau, trying to find her. Today I received word. She died last winter. She died free, the letter says. But she died without seeing us again, without knowing her grandchildren in their freedom. I cannot stop weeping." The later journals showed Samuel's continued success. By 1870, he owned multiple properties in Boston. He had investments in railroads and banks. He had become a respected figure in Boston's black community, known for his business acumen and his philanthropy. He donated to schools and churches. He helped other formerly enslaved people establish themselves. But there was always the shadow of the secret. Samuel's journal entries from later years showed a man haunted by the knowledge that his family's prosperity was built on stolen gold, even if that gold had been stolen from a man who had stolen Samuel's entire life. "James is to be married next month," Samuel wrote in 1875. "He is marrying the daughter of a minister, a fine young woman who believes James is the son of a man who always was free. He does not know the truth of his birth in bondage. Sarah and I decided long ago that our children would not carry the weight of that knowledge. They are freeborn in their minds, and that is how it should be. But sometimes I look at James, so confident and proud, and wonder what he would think if he knew where his father came from, how his father obtained the money that paid for his education." The final journal entry I found was dated December 1879. Samuel would have been 41 years old, though he wrote that he felt ancient. "I'm writing this as a record, though I do not know if anyone will ever read it," the entry began. "I have hidden these journals away, with some of the raw gold that remains, for I have kept some pieces, as proof perhaps, or as reminder. I do not know if my children or their children should know this truth. Part of me believes they should know the struggle their freedom cost. Part of me believes they are better served by thinking themselves descended from free people, untainted by the bondage that scarred their grandfather. I have lived 41 years, and more than half of them as a free man, though I am still not truly free. I am free in law, but the fear never leaves. Every knock on the door might be someone who knows the truth. Every white man who looks at me too long might be someone from Virginia. I have built something substantial for my family, but it is built on foundations that are not entirely legal. Was I wrong to take the gold? In the eyes of the law, yes. In the eyes of God, I hope not. Jeremiah Blackwood took my labor, my mother's labor, my father's labor before he was sold away. He took my childhood. He owned my wife and children as if they were livestock. If I took from him a fraction of what he took from us, I believe that was just But I wonder what my grandchildren will think, decades from now, if they ever learn the truth. Will they be ashamed? Will they understand? Will they think less of me? I hope they will understand that a man in chains does what he must to free himself and his family. That there is no theft from a thief. That gold dug from the earth by enslaved hands was never rightfully the master's to begin with. This is my testimony. This is my truth. May God judge me mercifully. I finished reading the final entry with tears streaming down my face. It was past midnight. My coffee had gone cold. But I sat there, stunned, trying to process everything I had learned. The story my family had told for generations, that Samuel had been a shrewd businessman who built wealth through legitimate investments, was true, but incomplete. The initial capital had come from stolen gold, gold that Samuel had risked his life to take, gold that had funded their escape and their new life. Over the next several days, I read through all the journals, studied the maps which showed the locations of the quarry on Thornfield Plantation, and examined the letters. The letters were from Joseph and from other people, business associates and friends, spanning decades. They painted a picture of Samuel as a man who was respected and admired, who used his wealth to help others. One letter from 1890 was from James, my great-great-grandfather, to Samuel, who was apparently ill at the time. James wrote, "Father, the doctor says you must rest. You have worked hard enough for 3 lifetimes. Because of you, I've had advantages you never dreamed of as a young man. I have education, property, respect. My children will have even more. Whatever you did to give us this life, I am grateful beyond words." I wondered if James knew the truth. The letter was ambiguous enough that he might have known or might have suspected. The question now was, what should I do with this information? I sat down with Lisa and told her everything. Her reaction was similar to mine, shock, followed by deep emotion, and finally, thoughtful consideration of the implications. "It's an incredible story," she said. "And Daniel, what Samuel did, stealing from the man who enslaved him, I don't think anyone could call that morally wrong. Legally, it was theft," I pointed out. "Legally, Samuel himself was considered property," Lisa countered. "We can't apply normal legal frameworks to slavery. It was an inherently illegal and immoral system." "But it means our family's wealth was built on stolen gold," I said, "even if the gold was stolen from someone who deserved to have it stolen." "No," Lisa said firmly. "Your family's wealth was built on Samuel's courage, intelligence, and hard work. The gold gave him a start, yes, but he built everything else through legitimate business. And Daniel, that gold was dug from the earth by enslaved people. In any moral sense, it belonged to them more than it did to Jeremiah Blackwood." I knew she was right, but I still struggled with what to do with the information. Should I keep it secret, as my father and grandmother apparently had? Should I share it with the extended family? Should I go public with it? I decided to start with the extended family. I called a meeting of everyone, my father, my aunt, uncle, cousins, and anyone else who was interested. I presented the journals and told Samuel's story in full. The reactions were varied. My father seemed relieved, almost, that the truth was finally out. "I've known since I was 20, he said. "My grandmother, Samuel's daughter-in-law, told me on her deathbed. She made me promise not to tell the younger generations. She said it would only complicate things, that the theft, even though justified, might give people the wrong idea about our family." Aunt Caroline was less comfortable with the revelation. "What if this gets out? What if people think we're descended from thieves?" "We're descended from enslaved people," I said sharply, "who freed themselves through extraordinary courage. That's what people should think." Uncle James agreed with me. "This is an incredible story of resistance and survival. We should be proud of Samuel, not ashamed." My cousin Marcus, who was a history professor, had a different concern. "This is historically significant. Samuel's journals, his account of escape, the detailed descriptions of plantation life and the Underground Railroad, scholars would find this invaluable." That comment planted a seed. Over the next several weeks, I consulted with historians, ethicists, and even a lawyer specializing in historical property claims. Though the lawyer confirmed what we already knew, any crime Samuel might have committed in 1862 was well beyond any statute of limitations. The consensus from the historians was clear. Samuel's story deserved to be told. It was a valuable historical document, and hiding it served no one. But they also counseled careful thought about how to present it. I ultimately decided on a path forward. I contacted a historian at the University of Virginia who specialized in slavery and the Civil War. I donated Samuel's journals, maps, and letters to the university's archives, where they would be preserved and made available to researchers. I worked with the historian to publish a scholarly article about Samuel's story. But I also decided to write something more personal. I wanted to tell Samuel's story not just as history, but as family history. I wanted my children, Marcus and Zoe, to know where they came from. I wanted them to understand what their ancestor had endured and overcome. So I wrote a book. It took me a year, balancing it with my regular work as an architect. It was part history, part memoir, part reflection on what Samuel's story means for our understanding of slavery, freedom, and the moral complexities of survival under an immoral system. The book, when published, generated more attention than I'd anticipated. Samuel's story resonated with people. Here was a man who had been enslaved, who had taken matters into his own hands in the most audacious way, and who had built a legacy that lasted generations. But there were also critics. Some people argued that I was glorifying theft. Others suggested that the Blackwood family, if any descendants could be found, had a claim on the story or even on some portion of the Hartwell family wealth. These arguments struck me as absurd. The very idea that a family that had enslaved people, that had profited from their labor, could claim any moral or legal right to wealth taken by those they had enslaved. The most meaningful responses came from other African American families who had their own hidden stories. I received dozens of letters and emails from people who said that Samuel's courage to create a new life inspired them to dig deeper into their own family histories, to uncover the stories that had been hidden or forgotten. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman in her 70s who said that her grandfather had told her, on his deathbed, that his father, her great-grandfather, had also escaped slavery with something valuable that he had taken from the plantation. She had never known what it meant, but reading about Samuel's story made her wonder if her ancestor had done something similar. For so long, she wrote, I felt shame about not knowing my family's full history, about the gaps and silences. Your book helped me understand that those gaps and silences were often strategic, meant to protect, and that what our ancestors did to survive and create better lives for us, whatever that was, deserves our respect and honor, not judgment. The impact on my own family was profound. My children, Marcus and Zoe, devoured the book when I gave them an age-appropriate version of the story. Marcus, at 10 years old, declared that Samuel was his hero. He dressed as Samuel for a school project on family history and gave a presentation that, according to his teacher, moved several of his classmates to tears. Zoe, at 8, had a simpler reaction. Great-great-great-great-grandpa Samuel was very brave, she said, and very smart. I'm glad he's our grandfather. My father's response was the most emotional. I've carried the weight of this secret for 40 years, he told me. Part of me always felt like we were living a lie, even though I knew rationally that what Samuel did was justified. Seeing it out in the open now, seeing people respond to his story with admiration rather than judgment, it's lifted something I didn't even realize I was carrying. Of course, the question remained, what to do about the wealth itself? The gold Samuel had taken in 1862 had been parlayed into real estate, investments, businesses. The Hartwell family was worth, collectively, somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars. All of it could be traced back, ultimately, to that gold taken from Thornfield Plantation. Some people suggested we should try to find descendants of Jeremiah Blackwood and make restitution. I researched this possibility and found that the Blackwood family line had died out in the early 1900s. The plantation itself had been sold multiple times and was now partially a housing development and partially a state park. Others suggested we should donate significant portions of our wealth to causes related to racial justice as a way of acknowledging the complex origins of our prosperity. This felt more meaningful to me. Working with my extended family, we established the Samuel Hartwell Foundation, endowed with $2 million initially, to provide scholarships and support to students from historically marginalized communities. It wasn't about guilt or shame. It was about honoring Samuel's legacy by using the prosperity he had created to open doors for others, just as he had used his initial freedom and resources to help other formerly enslaved people establish themselves in Boston. But perhaps the most important outcome was personal and educational. I spent months after the book's publication giving talks at schools, universities, and community organizations. I talked about Samuel's story, yes, but also about the broader themes, the ways that our official histories often erase or simplify the experiences of enslaved people, treating them as passive victims rather than the active agents they were, the moral complexities of survival under oppression, the courage it takes to risk everything for freedom. One talk I gave was at a high school in Virginia, not far from where Thornfield Plantation had been. After the talk, a young black student came up to me. Mr. Hartwell, she said, my family is from around here. We've always been here as far back as anyone can remember, but nobody talks about what that means, that we were probably enslaved on plantations nearby. Does that bother you? I asked gently. It used to, she said. It felt like a shameful secret. But hearing about Samuel, hearing about someone who didn't just wait to be freed, who took action, who risked everything, it makes me think differently about my ancestors. Maybe they were like Samuel. Maybe they did things to resist or survive that nobody talks about. It makes me want to find out. That conversation crystallized something for me. Samuel's story mattered not because it was unique. I'm sure there were other enslaved people who found ways to secure resources for their escapes, though few probably found literal gold. It mattered because it challenged the narrative of helpless victims waiting for freedom to be given to them by benevolent whites. It showed enslaved people as the architects of their own freedom. A year after publishing the book, I decided to visit the site of Thornfield Plantation. It was a strange experience, standing on land where Samuel had been enslaved, where he had worked in fields and mines, where he had made the audacious decision to steal gold and flee. Most of the plantation was gone, of course. The main house had burned down in 1920. The fields were now split between a housing development and the state park. But with the help of Samuel's maps and the State Historical Society, I was able to find the approximate location of the old North Quarry where Samuel had found the gold. It was just a depression in the earth now, partially filled in, overgrown with trees and brush. I stood there for a long time, trying to imagine Samuel working by torchlight, chipping away at the rock, knowing that discovery meant death, but continuing anyway because the alternative, a lifetime of bondage for himself and his family, was worse than death. I thought about the courage that must have taken, not just physical courage to face the danger, but moral courage to decide that he would take his family's fate into his own hands, to plan meticulously for months, to trust Sarah and Joseph with his life, to run with his young children through forests and swamps, never certain they would make it, but knowing they had to try. And I thought about what he had built with that stolen gold. Not just wealth, though there was that, but more importantly, freedom, education, opportunity, dignity, a legacy that had lasted 5 generations and counting. I knelt down and touched the earth where the quarry had been. "Thank you," I said quietly, not caring if anyone heard me talking to the ground. "Thank you for your courage. Thank you for the life you gave us. I hope we're honoring it well." As I stood to leave, I noticed something glinting in the soil. I brushed away some dirt and found a small, rough piece of quartz, golden in the afternoon sunlight. It wasn't gold, just a rock that caught the light in a particular way. But I kept it anyway, put it in my pocket as a reminder of where I came from, of the soil that held my family's secrets for so long. Back at home that evening, I added the piece of quartz to a small display I had created in my study. Samuel's journals, now returned to me after being digitized for the university archives, a photograph of his gravestone in Boston, which I had finally visited and paid to have restored, a map showing the route from Virginia to Boston, and a single remaining piece of the original gold that Samuel had kept, which my father had given me, saying, "This belongs with you now. You're the one who brought Samuel's story to light." Marcus came into the study while I was arranging these items. He stood next to me, looking at the display. "Dad," he said, "do you think Samuel would be proud of us?" It was a profound question from a 10-year-old. I thought carefully before answering. I think he would be proud that we're free, that we have opportunities he could barely imagine, that we know our history, even the hard parts. And I think he'd want us to use what he gave us, not just the money, but the courage he showed, to help others and to always fight for what's right. "Can I be like him when I grow up?" Marcus asked. "You already are," I said, putting my arm around his shoulders. "Every time you stand up for someone being bullied at school, every time you work hard at something difficult, every time you ask questions and want to know the truth, that's Samuel's legacy in you." Looking back now, a year and a half after finding those journals in my grandmother's basement, I realize that discovering Samuel's story changed more than just my understanding of family history. It changed how I see myself and my place in the world. I used to take our family's prosperity for granted, accepting the vague story of hard work and good business sense without questioning too deeply. Now I understand that our prosperity is rooted in an act of profound resistance. Samuel didn't just work hard within the system he was given. He broke the system. He took something that was being used to oppress him and turned it into a tool for liberation. That's a powerful legacy to carry. It means that when I face obstacles or injustices, I have an example of someone who refused to accept the limitations placed on him by society. When I think about how to use the advantages I've been given, I remember that those advantages came from someone who was given nothing, who had everything taken from him, and who still found a way to build something meaningful. But it's also a complicated legacy. The gold was stolen, even if it was stolen from a thief. The early years of establishing the family's wealth required lying about Samuel's past, about where he came from, and how he got his initial capital. The family maintained that lie for generations, which means that all of us who benefited from Samuel's courage also benefited from decades of secrecy. I've thought a lot about whether that secrecy was justified. Samuel clearly thought it was necessary. He writes about it explicitly in his journals, about the danger of being identified as a fugitive, about the need to protect his children by giving them the identity of freeborn people. And in the context of the 1860s and beyond, when fugitive slave laws were still in effect, and later when racial violence and discrimination were rampant, I can understand why the family chose to keep the story hidden. But in keeping it hidden, we also lost something. We lost the full, complex, powerful story of Samuel's resistance. We reduced him to a generic, successful businessman, rather than the remarkable person he was. Someone who dared to imagine freedom when he had been born in chains, who risked everything for that vision, and who succeeded against overwhelming odds. Now that the story is out, I feel a responsibility to keep telling it, not just in the book I wrote, but in conversations with my children and talks I give, in the way I think about our family's role in the world. The Samuel Hartwell Foundation has grown beyond our initial $2 million endowment. Other members of the family have contributed. We've funded scholarships for over 100 students. We've supported organizations working on issues of racial justice and educational equity. We've started a program that brings historians and genealogists into schools to help students research their own family histories. Each time we fund a scholarship or support a program, I think about Samuel. I imagine him in his blacksmith shop in Boston, helping another formerly enslaved person get established. I imagine him donating to schools and churches, sharing the wealth he had so daringly obtained. I think we're continuing that tradition, and that feels right. My father passed away last year at the age of 72. In his final months, when he knew his time was limited, he talked often about Samuel. I carried the secret for so long, he told me, thinking I was protecting the family. But you did the right thing, bringing it to light. Samuel's story deserves to be told. His courage deserves to be remembered. Did you ever wish you could go back and tell a younger version of yourself the truth? I asked him. He thought about this. Yes and no. Knowing the truth earlier would have been meaningful. But the way it happened, you discovering it, you choosing to share it, maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Every generation has to discover their history in their own way, make their own choices about what to do with it. I found that deeply wise. And it made me wonder what secrets might still be hidden, what stories are waiting to be discovered by my children or their children. What will Marcus and Zoe find when they go through my papers someday? What truths will they uncover that I don't even know I'm keeping? Because here's what I've learned. Every family has secrets, has complicated stories, has moments of courage and shame and survival that get simplified or hidden over time. Samuel's story is extraordinary in its details, the gold, the daring escape, the successful establishment of lasting wealth, but in its broader themes, it's universal. It's a story about people doing whatever they had to do to survive and protect their families, about the moral complexities of living in an immoral system, about courage that doesn't erase fear but acts despite it, about the ways that one person's bravery can echo through generations. My family's past was a mystery until I learned what my ancestor found beneath the soil, but in another sense, the mystery remains. I know the broad outlines of Samuel's life now, the major events and decisions, but I don't know everything. I don't know what he was thinking as he swung that pickaxe into the rock and saw gold. I don't know what Sarah whispered to him on the nights before their escape, when fear must have been overwhelming. I don't know what James thought as a child, running through the night not understanding why. Some mysteries will never be solved. Some experiences are so personal, so interior, that they die with the people who lived them. The journals give me Samuel's words, but not everything behind those words. What I do have is enough. Enough to understand where I come from. Enough to appreciate the sacrifices made for my freedom and prosperity. Enough to know that I have a responsibility to honor that legacy by living with courage, integrity, and commitment to justice. On the anniversary of finding the journals, I gathered my family, Lisa, Marcus, and Zoe, in my study. I had each of them write a letter to Samuel. Even though he'd been dead for over 100 years, I wanted them to think about what they would say to him if they could. Marcus wrote, "Dear great-great-great-great-grandpa Samuel, thank you for being so brave. Because of you, I get to go to a good school and have a nice house and never be a slave. I promise to be brave like you and to help people who need help. Love, Marcus." Zoe's letter was simpler. "Dear Grandpa Samuel, who is very old, I'm glad you took the gold because it was mean to make you be a slave. I hope you're happy in heaven with Grandma Ruth. Love, Zoe." Lisa wrote something longer, more reflective, about the ways that Samuel's courage had rippled forward through time, creating possibilities he could never have imagined. I wrote, "Dear Samuel, I found your journals. I know the truth now, where you came from, what you did, what you risked for your family's freedom. I want you to know that your courage wasn't wasted. Your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond have lived lives of freedom and opportunity because of what you dared to do. We know your story now. We honor it. We'll make sure it's never forgotten. Your great-great-great-grandson, Daniel." We burned the letters in a small ceremony in the fireplace, watching the smoke carry our words up and away, a symbolic message to an ancestor who changed everything. As the last of the paper curled and blackened in the flames, I thought about the weight of history, the way the past shapes the present in ways we don't always see or understand. I thought about how my comfortable life, my education, my opportunities, my children's future, all of it traced back to a man in chains who saw gold glinting in the rock and made a choice. Not an easy choice, not a simple choice, but a choice that required everything he had: courage, intelligence, luck, and an unshakable belief that he and his family deserved freedom, deserved dignity, deserved a future. That belief, I realize now, is Samuel's greatest gift to us. Not the gold itself, but what the gold represented. The refusal to accept the limits that society tried to place on him. The determination to write his own story rather than accept the story others had written for him. That's the legacy I want to pass on to Marcus and Zoe. Not just the story of where we came from, but the lesson embedded in that story, that we have the power to shape our own destinies, that courage can change everything, and that what we do today echoes forward into futures we'll never see. My family's past was a mystery until I learned what my ancestor found beneath the soil, but the real treasure wasn't the gold. It was the example of a man who refused to remain in chains, who risked everything for freedom, and who built a legacy that has sustained 5 generations and counting. That's worth more than all the gold in the world.